The mountains do not forgive. That is the first thing you learn in Kunar province. Not from a briefing, not from a manual. You learn it the way soldiers learn most things that matter, by watching what happens when someone forgets. The Hindu Kush rises in every direction here, sharp and indifferent ridgelines, cutting into sky the color of cold iron. The valleys between them are narrow, the roads are thin where they exist at all. The air at this elevation carries a particular quality of silence that settles over everything like a held breath, the silence of a place that has watched armies come and go for 3,000 years and expects to watch them go again. It was October 2011, and the war was still very much alive in Kunar. At Phoebe Wright in the Asadabad district, the morning had begun the way most mornings began, with routine, with coffee that tasted like motor oil and cardboard, with men going through the practiced motions of a life built on preparation. The base sat low against the valley floor, pressed between the river and the rock, and its perimeter fence had been repaired so many times that different sections of it now looked like different eras of the same long argument. Men were moving across the compound. Mechanics bent over rotors. Radio operators sat inside lit windows. A logistics sergeant was walking toward the motor pool with a clipboard and the expression of a man who had already identified 14 problems before 9 in the morning and expected to find 14 more. The day looked like any other day. By 8:53 that morning, everything would be different. At 8:53, a Black Hawk helicopter approached the landing pad from the northeast, dropping altitude against a sky that had finally gone blue and cold. Its approach was not the smooth descent of a routine return. It came in low and slightly off angle, and the men on the ground, who knew what they were looking at, recognized immediately that the aircraft was not flying the way a healthy aircraft flies. There was something in the sound of it, a roughness at the edges of the rotor cycle, a slight asymmetry in the way it held its heading. The landing pad had been quiet. Within 60 seconds of the radio call coming in, it was not quiet anymore. They came from across the base, not because anyone ordered them to. Word moves through a forward operating base the way fire moves through dry grass, fast, without asking permission. The men who had been in the motor pool came. The men who had been at the chow hall came. Soldiers from the 1327th Infantry came, some of them still carrying their food, most of them wearing the expression of people who were afraid to hope. They had sent men up on that helicopter. They did not know yet what they were about to see. The landing pad filled with people who did not speak. The helicopter touched down, and the rotors began their long, slow wind down, and the dust came up in curtains across the pad, and men raised their arms to shield their eyes. The side door opened. The first man to step out was a young soldier, barely 20 years old, his left hand wrapped in field dressing that had gone dark brown and stiff. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking out at the crowd, and then his face did something that was difficult to watch. He was not a man who cried. You could see that about him from 50 feet away. He had that particular stillness that young soldiers develop very quickly in places like Kunar, a stillness that was not peace, but rather the carefully maintained appearance of it. But when he stepped out of that helicopter and he saw the men waiting, something in him released. His shoulders came down, his jaw dropped slightly, and the stillness broke. He was the first to cry. He would not be the last. Men who had held themselves together through things that would have unraveled most people stood at the edge of that landing pad and wept. Not in the loud, broken way of men who have given up. In the way that men cry when they have been holding something for a very long time, and the thing they were afraid of did not come to pass. It was the sound of released pressure, of something narrowly survived. Then the last person stepped out of the aircraft. She was small. That was the first thing you noticed. She stood 5 feet 4 inches in her boots, and against the frame of that Black Hawk door, she looked like someone who did not belong in a place like this, until you looked more carefully, and then you understood that she belonged here more completely than most of the people watching her. She was 27 years old, and her name was Tessa Calloway, and her flight suit was soaked through with blood that was not hers. She stepped down onto the pad, and she looked out at the men who were looking at her. For a moment, nobody moved. Then a sergeant, a large, broad man from the infantry who had been in this country for 11 months and had not cried once, put his hand over his mouth. His eyes filled. He did not look away. Nobody could explain it clearly, not in the immediate hours after. Several of them tried later. They tried to find the right words for what they witnessed on that landing pad on a cold October morning. But words are approximate things, and what happened on that pad was something more precise than words can hold. What they had seen, what Caleb Tanner had transmitted through 4 short sentences to the first person standing next to him, and what spread outward from there in ripples, was the answer to a question that none of them had ever directly asked, but that every one of them carried somewhere in the center of their chest. The question of what a person does when there is nobody else. When everything has gone wrong. When the aircraft is broken and the crew is down and the men who needed protecting could not protect themselves. The answer was standing in front of them in a bloody flight suit. But to understand what had happened in those 62 minutes, to understand what Tessa Calloway had done and why it mattered and what it cost you, have to go back to the beginning of that morning. You have to go back to 5:47 when the base was still quiet and the mountains were still black against the sky just beginning to shade toward gray. Because the 62 minutes that changed everything did not begin when the helicopter left the landing pad. They began long before that. They began with a woman standing alone on a helipad reading a mountain range in the dark, remembering why she came. The helipad at FOB Blessing was nothing impressive. A flattened square of earth reinforced with wire mesh painted markers for orientation. A windsock that stood straight out in most conditions because the wind off the Peach River Valley did not believe in subtlety. There were sandbag barriers along two sides and a small maintenance shed on the northern edge where equipment was stored against the cold. Tessa Calloway had arrived at the pad at 5:47 that morning, 14 minutes before her alarm was set to go off, which was the same as every other morning she had been on this base. She stood at the western edge where the sandbag barrier was lowest, and she looked out at the mountains. In the pre-dawn, they were shapes more than objects, dark masses against the sky that was beginning very slowly to separate itself from the darkness. She could make out the general form of the ridgelines to the north and east, the way they cut and folded against each other, the places where the rock rose suddenly, and the places where it sloped more gradually toward the valley floor. She had been looking at these mountains every morning for 3 months, and she had the significant portions of them memorized the way some people memorize faces. The specific profile of the ridge at 280 degrees magnetic, where a notch in the rock line made a natural channel for wind. The high ground at about 40 degrees where the ridgeline broke into a series of stacked rock formations that offered significant concealment. The long, pale slash of exposed limestone on the eastern face of the hill that rose above the FOB's northeastern perimeter, a face that caught the first light of morning because of its angle and told you by the color and quality of that light what the wind was doing at altitude. Her father had taught her this, not in any formal way. He had taught her the way he taught her most things, by standing beside her and watching and asking questions and letting the answers come from what she already knew. Warren Calloway had been a warrant officer in the 161st Special Operations Aviation Regiment, a man who had spent enough hours in the air over difficult terrain that he thought about the ground the way other people think about weather, as something to be read and interpreted, factored into every plan. He had taught her to read ground the way he read it, as a pilot first, as a person who understood that what was below you determined what was possible above you. She had been 12 years old the first time he took her to the ridge behind their property in rural Tennessee and showed her how to look, not at individual trees or rocks or features, but at the overall shape of the land, the way water moved through it, the way shadow accumulated in certain folds, the way an elevated position was always in a specific geometric relationship to the lower positions around it. He had stood behind her and pointed and said quietly, "If you had to cross this without being seen, where would you go?" And she had looked and she had pointed, and he had said, "Now tell me where someone watching for you would be positioned to cut that route off." She had been 12 years old. By the time she was 16, she could do it faster than he could. She thought about that now, standing on the helipad in the darkness before dawn as she finished reading the ridgelines and let her gaze drop to the valley below. The Peach River was invisible at this hour, but she knew where it was by the sound, a low constant murmur that undercut everything else present in the silence. The way a very low note is present in music felt more than heard. The FOB's perimeter lights cast a pale yellowish glow along the wire, and beyond that glow was the absolute dark of a mountain valley at 5 in the morning. She was not afraid of the dark. She had not been afraid of the dark since the age of 14, when her father had made her sleep alone in the Ridge Woods 200 yards from the house for 3 consecutive nights with nothing but a sleeping bag, a water bottle, and a fixed blade knife, not as punishment, as education. Fear of the dark is fear of the unknown, he had told her. Then the unknown is just information you don't have yet. Go get the information. She had gotten the information. She reached into the chest pocket of her uniform and took out the photograph. It was folded once horizontally, and the fold had gone soft with handling. She unfolded it and held it in the dim light of the perimeter. A man in a flight suit standing in front of a Black Hawk helicopter, squinting slightly against the sun somewhere above and to the right of whoever was taking the picture. He was tall, lean in the shoulders, with the kind of stillness in his posture that some men acquire after a certain amount of time in certain kinds of work. He was smiling not broadly, but in the contained way of a man who does not perform happiness for cameras, but who is in that particular moment genuinely pleased with where he is and what he is doing. On the back of the photograph in handwriting she knew better than her own were a few words and a date: Fort Campbell, April 2003, the year before everything started to unravel. She had not known when that photograph was taken, that it would be the last record she would have of her father in a moment of uncomplicated happiness. She had not known that 3 years later he would be in Kunar province flying a mission that should have been straightforward, following a set of coordinates that someone had deliberately altered. She had not known that his helicopter would go down in a valley not far from where she was standing, and that the people who were supposed to send help would not send it, and that she would spend the years afterward not fully understanding why. She had come to Kunar to understand why. She had joined the army as a medic because that was the path that made sense for what she needed to do. A woman who wanted to be in the field, in the air, in the places where things actually happen. She had qualified as a 68 Whiskey, a combat medic specialist, and she had pushed hard for flight qualification, and she had gotten it, and she had requested assignment to a dust-off unit in Afghanistan, and she had gotten that too. And when the assignment orders had come through and she had seen the unit location, Kunar Province, Pech River Valley, she had folded the orders and put them in her pocket and gone outside to stand in the parking lot of the barracks building and breathe for a while. Her mother had not asked why she wanted to go to Kunar specifically. Her mother had not needed to ask. "Your father would tell you to be careful," Sandra Calloway had said, and then after a pause that contained several things that neither of them put into words, "but he'd also tell you to go." Tessa refolded the photograph and put it back in her chest pocket. She looked at the mountains for another moment, the ridgeline at 280 degrees, the high ground at 40 degrees, the pale limestone face catching the first suggestion of light on the eastern hill. Then she turned and walked back toward the maintenance shed to check her medical kit before the morning briefing. She checked everything twice. She would check it again before they boarded. She always did. Specialist Seth Kennard was a 23-year-old from a small town in rural Virginia that most people outside the state had never heard of. He was built like someone who had grown up doing physical work, not the gym-built mass of a person who trained for appearance, but the harder, more functional build of someone who had spent his adolescence loading trucks and cutting timber and doing the thousand small physical tasks that life in an agricultural area demands. He had been a crew chief for 14 months. He had 64 combat missions. He was good at his job and he knew it, and his confidence sat on him the way it sits on people who have earned it completely without advertisement. He was performing his pre-flight checks on the UH-60 at 6:45 when CW-3 Leland Grouse arrived and began his own walk-around on the opposite side of the aircraft. Grouse was 40 years old from Wyoming, a man of few words whose silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that came from having absolutely nothing to prove to anyone. He had the hands of someone who had been working with machinery since before he could legally drive, and he used them on the aircraft now with the assured economy of long practice. Kennard finished checking the port side door mechanism and looked across the fuselage at the medical kit being loaded into the back of the aircraft by the FOB's logistics specialist, a man who was not flying this mission and was therefore, in Kennard's view, handling the equipment with insufficient care. "Hey," Kennard said. The logistics specialist looked up. "That goes in strapped down. If we hit weather, the last thing I need is your kit sliding into the equipment rack." The logistics specialist, to his credit, refastened the straps without argument. Tessa arrived at the aircraft at 6:52, which was 8 minutes before the briefing was scheduled to begin and 45 minutes before they were scheduled to lift off. She was carrying her own medical bag, a stomp bag modular medical equipment packed by her own hands in an order she had developed over 14 months of flight medicine, and a secondary pack assembled specifically for this mission based on the casualty profile she had been given the night before. She stowed both in the back of the aircraft herself, securing each strap, checking each clasp, arranging the contents in the sequence in which she expected to use them. Kennard watched her from the front of the aircraft. He had the particular quality of observation that belonged to people who spent a lot of time managing complex machinery. He watched things with assessment in his eyes, noting what was being done and comparing it against what he expected to see. What he expected to see was a medic loading a kit. What he saw was a medic loading a kit with a precision and economy of motion that he had not expected from someone her age and her time in theater. There was no wasted movement. The items went into the compartments in a specific order, and she did not have to think about what came next. Her hands knew. He filed this away without comment and went back to his pre-flight. CW2, Owen Harwick arrived at 3 minutes to 7. He was 35 years old, broad across the shoulders with dark circles under his eyes that had become so permanent over 4 years of deployments that they no longer indicated anything about how well he had slept. He was from Montana, from a ranching family outside Billings, and he had that quality of stillness that belongs to men who have grown up in landscapes that do not require conversation. He had been flying medevac missions for 6 years. He had a small, laminated image of St. Christopher fixed to the instrument panel of every aircraft he flew, pressed flat with his thumb each time replaced when aircraft were changed, a private ritual that he had never explained to anyone who asked about it. He walked the perimeter of the aircraft, noted the tail rotor clearances, checked the engine nacelles, checked the skids, and then came to stand beside Kennard. "Who's the doc?" "Calloway. 3 months in theater. First time in Sector 7. Harwick looked toward the back of the aircraft where Tessa was finishing her kit arrangement. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "She going to be all right in a hot LZ?" "She's got the quals," Kennard said. "Can't tell you more than that yet." Harwick nodded. This was not skepticism in the dismissive sense. It was the professional concern he would have had for any crew member going into a high-threat extraction area for the first time. Hot landing zones were a specific kind of experience. Credentials told you what a person had been trained to do. They did not tell you what a person would actually do when the coordinates that looked clean on a map turned out not to be clean at all. He went into the briefing at 7 o'clock with that question still open. The briefing room was a plywood-walled space inside one of the base's larger buildings, lit by overhead fluorescence that gave everything a slightly sallow cast. Physical maps covered the walls, the kind that could be read and marked without power, and a whiteboard at the front of the room held the relevant grid references already written in black marker. Folding chairs faced the whiteboard, and most of them were filled. The flight crew sat in the front row, Harwick and Grouse, Kennard, and Tessa. Behind them sat several members of the base operations staff who would be monitoring the mission, and in the back row, almost at the door, a man from the intelligence section who had the particular quality of watchfulness that intelligence people develop when they have been doing their work for a long time. He was not the most senior officer in the room, but he was the most observant, and he watched Tessa in a way that she noticed, but could not account for a steady measuring attention that went beyond professional interest. The briefing officer was a captain named Aldrin, 28 years old, careful with his language. He stood at the whiteboard and read from his notes with the focused attention of a man who understood that details mattered. "Mission is medevac extraction, priority urgent," he began. 4 casualties at grid November Kilo 4471-8823 currently held at a casualty collection point approximately 400 meters east of the Peach River in the broken terrain above the river road. Current situation element of 327th Infantry Bravo Company made contact with enemy forces at approximately 0300 this morning. Contact was sustained. The element has 4 priority casualties requiring immediate extraction. Priority 1 is a vascular wound to the thoracic cavity with suspected pneumothorax. Casualties have been treated by the unit medic to the extent possible with available equipment. Priority 1 is deteriorating and will not survive ground transport due to terrain and continued threat to the route. Request was called in at 0630. Time on target window is approximately 55 to 60 minutes from wheels up. Harwick looked at the grid reference on the whiteboard. He had flown into the general area before. He did not volunteer this. Threat assessment, the captain continued, is elevated. The area of grid November Kilo has had episodic enemy activity over the past 72 hours. Route Alpha into the LZ passes through a section of valley that is approximately 3/4 of a kilometer wide at its narrowest with high ground on both flanks. ISR coverage has been limited due to asset availability. There is no confirmed enemy presence along the route at this time, but there is also no confirmed absence. Grouse shifted slightly in his chair. This was the difference between clear and we don't have eyes on it, and it was a difference that mattered. Apache escort will be provided by Hawk 2-1. They will cover your approach from your left flank and will remain on station during the extraction. Communication will be on the standard dust-off frequency with Hawk 2-1 on the secondary. Any questions about the tactical picture? Harwick raised one finger. LZ configuration. Improved, used before. The unit is at the site and will be able to provide visual and smoke. There is space for 1 aircraft at a time. 1 in, 1 out, Harwick said. Correct. Kennard leaned forward slightly. Ground element, how many effectives? 8. 4 are the casualties. 4 are ambulatory and armed. They will provide security on the ground during the extraction. Tessa was not looking at the whiteboard. She was looking at the map on the wall behind the captain, specifically at the topography around grid November Kilo. She was reading the contour lines the way her father had taught her to read them, not as abstract cartography, but as a description of what the ground would actually do to you when you were in it. The valley was narrow at the approach. Flying Route Alpha meant spending several minutes below the level of the high ground on both sides, which meant that anyone positioned on those ridges had a significant angle advantage on an aircraft moving through the valley floor. The LZ itself was in broken terrain above the river road. Broken terrain meant limited sight lines, limited room to maneuver, and an approach path largely dictated by topography rather than pilot preference. She filed this. She held her question for when she could see the actual ground instead of the paper version of it. The captain said a few more words about communication protocols and dismissed the room. As the crew rose and moved toward the door, Kennard fell into step beside Grouse. His voice was low, not unfriendly, simply practical. "First time in Sector 7, he said again. Grouse did not look at him. Every time is someone's first time. Harwick was the last of the crew to leave. He paused at the door and looked back at the map still mounted on the wall. At the narrow valley, at the contour lines around grid November Kilo, at the single word that the captain had not used but that experienced pilots kept in the back of their minds whenever they read terrain like that. The word was channelized. It meant that the terrain was forcing you along a path you did not choose. He put on his helmet and went to fly. The pre-flight preparation took 39 minutes. Tessa spent most of those minutes at the back of the aircraft going through her medical kit for the third time. The third pass was not about uncertainty. It was about something more fundamental, the same instinct that makes a person check the door lock twice before bed. Not because they don't believe it's locked, but because some things are too important to leave to memory alone. She went through the kit in order. Tourniquets, 6 combat application tourniquets wound tight and ready to deploy with one hand. Chest seals, 4-vented chest seals for the tension pneumothorax she had been briefed on. Nasopharyngeal airways in 3 sizes. Hemostatic gauze. Combat gauze packed tightly for hemorrhage control. Needle decompression kits. 14-gauge needles for bilateral decompression if needed. IV kits and fluid. Morphine autoinjectors. The cardiac monitor. The portable suction device. The bag valve mask. She went through each item by touch and by sight. She knew from the casualty report that priority 1 was thoracic vascular wound suspected pneumothorax. She arranged her kits so that the items she would need first were accessible first. This was not complicated. This was just practice. When she finished the third pass, she closed the main compartment and left it secured to the floor. Then she checked the restraints on the cot framework and verified that the oxygen supply valve was open and the regulator was reading correctly. She sat on the fold-down medic's seat beside the main door facing aft and looked out the open door at the pre-dawn sky, which had gone from gray to a pale flat blue, deepening as the sun came up behind the eastern ridge. Connor came around the front of the aircraft, finished with his own final checks. He stopped when he saw her sitting in the door. She was not doing anything obvious. She was sitting still, looking out, and in that stillness, there was something difficult to categorize the quality of attention that a person has when they are listening carefully to something that most people would not hear at all. "Good to go on the medical side?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Hot LZ extractions, you've done them before." She looked at him. "Yes," he nodded. He was about to say something else when he noticed her right hand resting on her thigh, specifically on the holster secured there. Not gripping it, just resting on it. The way a person's hand rests on a familiar object without conscious intention. The contact of long habit. Most flight medics carried a sidearm. It was not unusual, but there was something in the way her hands sat on that holster that gave him a brief pause. He did not remark on it. He went around to the starboard door to complete his checks. Grouse arrived and completed his own preparation sequence with the economy of a man who had done it enough times that the actions had become purely inhabited, not thoughtless, but requiring no deliberation. He ran through his checklist, verified fuel state, tested the cyclic and collective for full range of motion, confirmed avionics were powering up correctly. Harwick came last, as aircraft commanders do, because the aircraft commander's job is to verify that everyone else has done their job before performing their own. He walked the aircraft, checked the tail rotor clearance, checked the main rotor blades, checked the engine nacelles, and then climbed into the left seat and settled himself in. He reached up and attached the St. Christopher image to the instrument panel with a fresh piece of medical tape from his pocket. He pressed it flat with his thumb, Then he put on his helmet and began the engine start sequence. The two General Electric T700 turbine engines came to life in sequence. A rising whine that became a roar settled and found its rhythm. The main rotor began to turn. Slowly at first, then faster, building toward operating speed until the whole aircraft was alive with controlled vibration and the familiar deep thudding of rotor wash. At 0749, Harwick keyed his radio. Dustoff 77 Fall Blessing Tower. Ready for departure. Dustoff 77, you are cleared for departure. Winds are 270 at 8 knots. Visibility unrestricted. At 0751, the aircraft lifted. The Peak River Valley in the morning light was something that defied easy description. It was beautiful in the way that indifferent things are sometimes beautiful without any consideration for the observer, without concession to human preference. The river ran silver-brown below them, visible in flashes between the rock and the scrub pine, winding through a valley that rose on both sides into ridgelines touched at their crests by the first horizontal light of day. The colors were extraordinary: ochre and red and gray rock, dark green of the conifers, the deep shadow that still pooled in the lowest folds of the terrain. The sky above was a blue so clear it seemed to have weight. Tessa looked at it through the open side door and she thought, this is what he flew over. This exact valley. 5 years ago he looked down at this. She kept the thought brief. She had learned over a long time that thoughts worth keeping had to be kept brief in moments like this, or they would occupy space that needed to be clear. In the right seat, Grouse was managing the navigation, calling out waypoints as they progressed along the planned route. Harwick was flying smooth, economical inputs, the kind of flying that looks effortless, because everything extraneous has been removed. In the back, Conrad was at the door gun on the starboard side. His M240H swung out and locked into position, his eyes moving across the terrain below, with the steady, systematic sweep of long practice. The Apache Hawk 2-1 was visible 2 kilometers to their left and slightly above, moving parallel to their track. Its presence was a comfort, though a measured one. Comfort in the sense that it was there. Measured in the sense that what an Apache could prevent and what it could not prevent were 2 different lists. At 8 minutes into the flight, Tessa's radio crackled. Grouse's voice from the front seat. Coming up on waypoint November, valley narrows in approximately 4 clicks. She looked out the port side door. The valley was beginning to compress, the ridgelines on either side drawing closer, the floor of the valley rising slightly to meet the walls. Below, the river road was barely visible through the vegetation, a pale thread of track that followed the water and then disappeared into shadow. She was reading the high ground. She looked at the ridgeline on the northwest side, the one they would be flying beneath, as the valley narrowed, and she noted the specific texture of it. Rock formations that had stacked into natural terraces. Ledges wide enough to serve as firing positions. Vegetation sparse enough at the crest that lines of sight would be long. There was a particular section, perhaps 280 meters along the northwestern ridge, at a point where a natural notch in the rock created a kind of natural parapet where the rock face caught the morning light at a specific angle, and something caught the morning light back. It was brief. A flicker of reflected brightness that was gone before she could focus on it. Most people would not have noticed. Most people were not looking for it. But she had been taught to look for exactly that kind of mismatch, the difference between ambient light and what a surface ought to be producing, the signature of glass or polished metal where glass and polished metal did not belong. She keyed her intercom. Harwick, go ahead. Northwest ridge, the rock notch at approximately 11 o'clock. I had a flash of reflected light. Duration less than a second. Angle consistent with an optic or glass surface. A pause. Grouse shifted in his seat. Harwick's hands did not move on the controls. His attention was already processing what she had said. Hawk 2-1 Dustoff 77, Harwick said. We have a possible observation point, northwest ridge, 11 o'clock, off our track, approximately 4 kilometers. Can you give me eyes on that position? Hawk 2-1 acknowledged and began a turn to acquire the position. For 20 seconds, nobody spoke. Then Hawk 2-1 came back. Dustoff 77, we are not acquiring anything definitive at the position described. Rock formation, natural shadow. No thermal signature consistent with armed personnel. Harwick processed this. Possible but not confirmed. He keyed the intercom. Calloway, good call. We keep our eyes open. Yes, sir. Conrad looked at her from across the interior of the aircraft. He had been a crew chief for 14 months, and he had flown with many medics. He had seen people call out possible contacts before. But the way she had said it, the specificity of it, the elevation, the bearing, the angle of the reflected light, relative to their track in the position of the sun. That was not the observation of someone who had glanced at a ridge and noticed something. That was the observation of someone who had been systematically reading that ridge for the last 3 minutes and knew exactly what she was looking at. He looked at her for a moment longer than he intended to. Then he looked back at his sector. She was already reading the next section of terrain. They were 16 minutes into the flight, descending to approach altitude as the LZ drew within range when Harwick's voice came through the intercom with a quality that Tessa had learned to recognize in people who had found something they did not expect. "Callaway, pull up the nav display on your panel." She did. The grid reference for the LZ was displayed alongside their current track. "Read me the grid we were briefed," he said. She read it from her notes. "November Kilo 447188823. Now read me what the nav is showing as our current destination." She looked at the display. She read it out. The numbers were different. November Kilo 461488907, a difference of 1.1 kilometers east-northeast directly into the section of valley where the high ground pressed closest on both sides, where the ridge lines created the longest and most unobstructed lines of fire from above. Nobody spoke for a moment. "Someone updated the nav database after briefing," Grouse said, his voice careful and flat. "That's not a data entry error. The briefed grid and the loaded grid are different coordinates in different terrain. Someone changed it deliberately." "Who has access to update aircraft nav databases on this FOB?" Tessa asked. Nobody answered her. The answer was understood. Nav database updates on a FOB required authenticated access, command-level access. One. They required someone inside the structure. Harwick keyed the radio to the FOB blessing command frequency. "Viper 6 Dustoff 77, confirm LZ grid for current mission." "Over." The response came in less than 10 seconds. The voice was calm, professional, familiar. "Dustoff 77 grid is as briefed. What is your status?" The grid the voice had confirmed was the briefed grid, not the one loaded in the nav system. Harwick looked at Grouse. Grouse looked at the nav display. Harwick did not correct the navigation through the command channel. He flew toward the briefed grid, the correct one, manually using the chart. He did not transmit again. In the back, Tessa was very still for a moment. Then she continued reading the terrain because the terrain still needed to be read, and because the thing she had just understood was a problem for after the mission, and the mission was still in progress. The valley opened slightly ahead of them as they approached the correct grid. The LZ was visible now, a crease in the hillside above the river road, orange smoke rising from it, bending slightly northeast in the valley wind. 8 soldiers on the ground, 4 of them casualties. A unit that had held a position through the night and was waiting. Conrad had shifted his door gun toward the northwest ridge again, tracking it methodically. His jaw was tight. Harwick keyed the radio. "Bravo 16 Dustoff 77, we are 1 minute out, smoke identified. How copy?" The response came from the ground, a voice steady in the way that voices get when a person has been up all night requiring steadiness and has used everything else. "Dustoff 77, Bravo 16, copy. We are ready for you." Harwick adjusted his approach track. He began his descent. The landing zone was a narrow shelf of ground and broken terrain. One way in, one way out. High ground on 3 sides. Barely large enough for the aircraft usable, because it had been used before, and the soldiers on the ground had cleared enough of the larger rocks from the surface to allow a landing skid to rest without the aircraft being on a dangerous angle. Harwick flew them in. Tessa unstrapped from her seat. She positioned herself at the side door ready to move. She had done this before. The moment the skids touched the ground, the moment Harwick called it, she would be moving. Conrad was on his door gun sweeping. The 4 ambulatory soldiers on the ground were in position around the perimeter, weapons out facing the high ground in every direction. They had that particular posture of men who had been at it too long, bodies still running on the discipline training provides, but with exhaustion underneath it that showed in the slight slump of the shoulders. The aircraft was 6 feet above the ground, 4 feet. Harwick said, "Landing." Tessa went out the door before the skids fully settled. She hit the ground running, bent low beneath the rotor arc, moving toward the cluster of casualties at the far edge of the LZ, her medical bag in her left hand. The noise on the landing zone was enormous rotor wash, engine noise, the intermittent pop of small arms fire that was present in the hills somewhere in the middle distance, not directed at them, but present. The way certain things are always present in places like this. She reached the casualties. Priority 1 was a large man brought across the chest, lying on his back on a section of ground that had been cleared and padded with someone's sleeping roll. He had a field dressing pressed against his right chest, holding it there with his own hand, and the quality of his breathing, even from 3 feet away, told her several things immediately. Shallow. The affected side of the chest not expanding the way the other side was. A distinctive sound between a wheeze and a gurgle that told her the air pressure in that thoracic cavity was not what it should be. Tension pneumothorax. Not suspected. Present. She was already opening her kit. The man looked up at her. He was in significant pain and managing it with the focused attention of someone who understood that losing control of himself would not improve the situation. His eyes were clear and deliberate, the eyes of someone working very hard to stay present. Needle decompression, she said partly to herself, partly to the sequence of steps she was already running through. I know, he said. His voice was rough but controlled. Second intercostal space mid-clavicular line. She paused. She looked at him. You've had this before. Similar, he said. She verified the position and prepared the needle. The process took 11 seconds from the time her hand went into the kit. She inserted the needle with the practiced motion of someone who had performed the procedure in difficult conditions many times, and she heard the distinctive sound of air release. And the man's breathing changed immediately, measurably, in the way that good interventions change things. He drew a longer breath. His face registered something adjacent to relief. She was already applying the chest seal over the wound site. What's your name? She asked. Wynn, he said. Garrett Wynn, Sergeant First Class? Your lung has been reinflating since approximately 10 seconds ago. I need to get you in the aircraft. Can you help me or do you need a full carry? I can help. Then on my count. They got him up. Two of the ambulatory soldiers assisted. Tessa directed the movement with the efficiency of someone who did not have time to explain what she was doing and had enough competence that explanation was not required. She had Wynn strapped to the cot framework with the primary IV line running before she was back out the door. Priority 2 was a young soldier named Caleb Tanner, sitting upright with his left hand wrapped in a compression bandage that had done its job adequately under field conditions. He was pale but alert with the slightly too wide eyes of someone who had been running on adrenaline for 8 hours and could feel it beginning to fade. Can you walk to the aircraft? She asked. Yes, ma'am. Then walk. She stayed beside him. She was already doing the triage calculation for the remaining 2 casualties, SSG Bryce Holden with shoulder and hip wounds, PVT Wade Eckert with severe burns to both legs, and working through the sequence of treatment priorities for the flight. Eckert was the one she would need to watch most carefully. Burns that extensive created significant risk of airway compromise if anything in his pulmonary status changed, and pain management requirements would be demanding for the full duration of the flight. She helped load Holden and Eckert with the remaining soldiers' assistance. She established an IV line on Eckert while the loading was still happening because the morphine needed to be running before the aircraft moved. She was still connecting the line when she heard it, the sound of a weapon discharging somewhere high on the northwestern ridgeline, and then the distinct hammering of Conard's M240H door gun responding, and then Harwick's voice. Hot LZ, loading now, confirm status. The RPG did not hit the aircraft directly. It hit a rock formation 15 meters aft of the tail and detonated against the stone, and the overpressure and shrapnel from that detonation caught the tail rotor assembly as it passed. The aircraft lurched. Tessa pressed herself against the aft bulkhead with one hand locked around the cot frame, keeping her body between the equipment rack and Eckert's cot. Her ears registered the sound of metal under sudden stress. Conard's M240H went silent. Not because he had stopped firing. She looked. Conard was slumped against the doorframe, his right arm hanging wrong. A fragment had found the gap between his body armor and his sleeve. He was conscious, his eyes open, but his right arm was not working. The remaining ambulatory soldiers slapped the side of the aircraft twice. Clear. Everyone's in. Go. Tessa pulled the door shut and locked it. She was already moving toward Conard when Harwick pulled collective and the helicopter lifted. The aircraft did not sound right as it climbed. The tail rotor, she could hear it in the changed quality of the vibration through the airframe, a resonance that had not been there before, a cycling irregularity at a frequency she felt in her back teeth. Harwick's voice on the intercom, Calloway, we have tail rotor damage. I'm compensating. It's manageable for now. She filed this. She reached Conard and assessed his arm fragment wound to the forearm, significant bleeding but no arterial involvement. She applied a tourniquet below the elbow and a pressure dressing and told him to stay against the wall. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has just had his function removed from him at the worst possible time. You can still watch, she said. Watch the port door. He nodded. He turned to watch the door. She went back to her patients. They were 18 minutes out of Phobe Blessing. She was checking Wynn's IV line when she noticed the change in his breathing. Not dramatic, subtle, a slight increase in effort on the affected side, a small tightening around his jaw. She checked his oxygen saturation by feel his fingertips had the faint blue undertone that told her the saturation was declining. The chest seal was working, but the underlying pressure was building again. Not unusual for a significant pneumothorax. She would need to monitor it continuously. She adjusted the oxygen flow and positioned herself so she could watch both Wynne and Eckert simultaneously. Tanner was seated against the aft bulkhead with his wrapped hand held against his chest, tracking everything with the alert, systematic attention of someone who had decided the most useful thing he could do was observe clearly. Then she heard it. It was not a sound from inside the aircraft. It was a sound from outside the aircraft, specifically from the exterior of the fuselage, on the port side below, and aft of the main cabin door. A sound that did not belong to the normal inventory of sounds that a UH-60 makes in flight. It was deliberate. It had weight behind it, metal on metal, moving upward. She looked at the main cabin door. Tanner was looking at the door too. His good hand had moved to the frame of the cot he was sitting against. The sound came again, closer now, and then at the lower edge of the cabin door window, a shape, a dark shape resolving as it moved. A hand, a gloved hand gripping the exterior frame. Tessa looked at the hand for exactly 1 second. She reached for the M9 in the holster on her right thigh. Her hand found it with the same automatic precision that it found the needle decompression kit, the chest seal the IVE line, because she had made sure of it over many years and in many different circumstances until knowing was no longer required, and the body simply went where it was supposed to go. The door began to move, and Tessa Calloway moved to meet it. The door did not open all at once. It moved in increments, the latch mechanism resisting slightly, before giving the way a door resists when the pressure on the outside is applied not with a handle, but with the brute leverage of a body pressed against the exterior frame. Tessa had the M9 in her hand, and her weight distributed across both feet, and her eyes on the gap that was opening at the edge of the door frame, and in the 2 seconds between recognizing what was happening and the door swinging fully inward, she processed the situation with a clarity that had nothing to do with calm and everything to do with the fact that she had been preparing for high-stress decisions since she was 12 years old. One hand on the door frame, large, tactical glove, black reinforced knuckle panels. The stitching pattern was wrong for military-issue private contractor equipment purchased from specialty suppliers rather than drawn from a government supply room. That was the first thing she noted. The second was the angle. The person outside was not coming in through the door the way a person enters a room. He was coming in from below, which meant he had been climbing, had reached the aircraft from underneath, or from the side while they were flying, which meant he had been attached to the aircraft or dropped onto it from something above. This was not improvised. This had been planned before they left Blessing. The door swung in. He came through it with the efficiency of a man who had made forced entries before leading with his right shoulder body, turned to present the smallest possible profile head down, and rising as he cleared the frame. He wore a one-piece flight suit in flat black with no markings, no patches, no unit insignia. His face was covered by a balaclava, and he wore ballistic eyewear. In his right hand, held close to his body, was a suppressed submachine gun, an HK MP-7 she identified in under a second from the distinctive profile of the suppressor and the short barrel. The weapon was designed specifically for confined spaces, designed for a space exactly this size. He was approximately 200 pounds. He was 6 feet tall, which in the 4.5-foot headroom of the medevac cabin meant he came in crouched and stayed that way. He moved with the practiced economy of someone who had been in environments like this before. He was not American military. His equipment was wrong. His posture was wrong. The way he held the MP-7 was the posture of someone who had been trained in systems outside the standard military instruction chain. What he was, she would understand later. Right now, she understood only what she needed to understand. He was in the aircraft and he was armed, and he was a problem that she was going to have to solve herself. She was 115 feet above a mountain valley in an aircraft with a compromised tail rotor, and a crew chief with a non-functional arm, and a pilot who did not yet know what had just come through the door. She had 4 patients and one M9 Beretta with 15 rounds in the current magazine and 2 spare magazines in the pouch on her left thigh. She had the weapon in her hand, and the right angle was not yet available because Wynne was on the cot between her and the door. She went left toward the aft bulkhead, away from Wynne, changing the angle. It was not dramatic. She stepped quickly and deliberately 2 paces that changed her position relative to Wynne and opened a firing line that did not cross his body. He tracked her. The MP-7 followed. Then the aircraft moved. It was a slight correction, Harik adjusting his heading in response to the valley wind, a minor cyclic input that translated into a half-second of lateral motion in the cabin. It was the kind of motion that nobody in a functioning crew would notice because they were braced and accustomed to it. He was not braced. He was in a partial crouch, moving across an unfamiliar floor, tracking a moving target, and the aircraft's sudden lateral shift dropped his weight to the wrong foot. He corrected quickly, professionally, but with a momentary redistribution of attention. Tessa fired. She aimed low and right away from the cabin wall, away from the equipment bays and avionics conduits. She fired once fast, and the round went into his right thigh above the knee, the outer quadriceps, not the femoral triangle, not a killing shot, not intended to be. It was intended to produce pain of a specific kind, the kind that travels upward through the hip and destabilizes the base that makes standing without full weight bearing suddenly difficult. He produced a sound that was not quite a grunt, and he went to one knee. She was already moving toward the starboard side of the cabin, putting the equipment rack between herself and the MP7. Tanner had pressed himself into the far corner of the cabin, his wrapped hand held against his chest, his back against the aft bulkhead. He was not panicking. His eyes were tracking everything, absorbing it, with the wide, deliberate attention of someone who had decided that the most useful thing he could do in this moment was to see it clearly. The intruder rose from his knee. The leg was functioning. She had not severed anything critical. He was carrying the wound as a cost, which meant he was going to keep moving. The wound had bought her approximately 3 seconds. She put her back against the equipment rack on the starboard side and evaluated her angles. The cabin was 10 feet long, 6 feet wide. The door on the port side was open. The intruder was between her and the port door, which was also between her and Wynne. He knew this. She could see in the way he positioned himself that he knew it. He was not rushing her. He was managing the space, controlling the geometry of it. Then his attention shifted. The movement was brief and controlled, but she caught it, a fractional tilt of his chin toward the front of the aircraft, toward the radio equipment, not toward the cockpit exactly, toward communication. He was receiving instructions, or had received them recently, and the reflex of that connection still lived in his body. Someone was in contact with him. Someone who knew they were in the air right now. Someone with access to their flight profile. She thought about the nav coordinates. She thought about the voice on the radio that had calmly confirmed the briefed grid. She thought about the changed numbers on the nav display. The intruder was here because someone with command-level access to this FOB's systems had put him here, had known this aircraft's route, had provided that route to someone who had planned for a man in black contractor kit to be waiting in the air above their LZ. She moved. She came off the equipment rack and went low and toward the port side, not toward him, but toward the cot framework, because the cot framework was bolted to the cabin floor and provided both a handhold and a positional anchor. She got her left hand on the forward crossbar of the cot frame, and she brought the M9 up. He came at her. He was done managing geometry. He brought the MP7 down. He did not fire it, and she noted this. He wanted to avoid the sound of gunfire if he could, because gunfire meant forensics and residue and documentation, and whatever he was doing here, he wanted to be deniable. He came with his body, using his weight, closing the distance, and bringing his right forearm across to deflect the M9 away from his center line. He was stronger than her. He was 80 pounds heavier and structurally larger, and he had been trained in exactly the kind of close-quarters fighting that this space required. What he did not have was familiarity with this specific space. She had been in this cabin or cabins exactly like it every working day for 3 months. She knew where every bolt was. She knew the clearance between the cot frame and the port bulkhead. She knew that at the aft end of the equipment rack, there was a corner bracket that jutted out 4 inches from the surface at exactly the height of a large man's hip when he was crouching. She let him close. She did not fight the deflection of the M9. She rolled with it, letting her wrist follow the force of his block, which brought her a half-step left and slightly behind him. The half-step left put her at his right flank, the corner bracket at his hip level. She drove her left elbow into the back of his right shoulder, hard and downward, and his body rotated with it, and his hip connected with the corner bracket, and the impact threw his balance forward, and he went into the starboard wall with his left hand out. The MP7 came loose from his right hand. It hit the floor and slid toward the open port door, and for a suspended moment it seemed like it would go out the door, and then it caught on the door sill, lip, and stopped there, half in and half out, the suppressor hanging in the airstream. She had the M9 back in two-hand grip. He turned from the wall. They were both breathing. His leg was bleeding into his flight suit. Her left wrist had taken the impact of his forearm block. A pause, not long, perhaps 2 seconds, while they both assessed the new state of things. Then he looked at her through the ballistic eyewear and he spoke. His voice was American. The flat vowels of the inland states controlled enough that she could not narrow it further. He said, "You don't know what you're holding on to, Calloway." She said nothing. "That man is carrying something that does not belong to him. Give it to me and I walk away. That's the whole of it." He knew her name. She filed that away. He knew her name and he knew what Wynn was carrying, and he had been placed on this aircraft with that specific knowledge, which meant that the information about this mission, the timing, the route, the specific presence of Wynn as a casualty had been communicated to whoever had sent him. She said, "Who sent you?" It was not a question in the sense that she expected an answer. She said it to watch what his body did instead of answering. People who will not answer a question still answer it through other channels. What he did was glance toward the front of the aircraft. The movement was brief and controlled, but it was there a fractional tilt of his chin toward the radio equipment, toward the frequency that was currently open to FOB Blessing Command. He was receiving instructions, or had recently received them, and the reflex of that connection lived in him still. He moved. He came across the cabin without the MP7, willing to take the risk of close contact to avoid the evidentiary problem of gunfire. He was fast. He was trained. And he was betting that his physical advantage would overcome her positional one. She went to the port side toward Wynn's cot, and she put the cot between herself and him. She had the M9 on him. She said flat and without escalation, "Stop." He stopped. Moving around the cot meant exposing himself to the M9 at close range with no angle of deflection, and he was evaluating the math. "You're going to shoot me," he said. "If you come over this cot, I'm going to put a round through your knee. Then we'll have a very different conversation." He looked at the cot. He looked at Wynn on the cot. His gaze went to the sealed pouch visible through the fabric of Wynn's left chest pocket, a rigid outline, something encased in a waterproof container. Something that someone had decided was worth killing for. "Whatever's in that pocket," he said, "is going to hurt a lot of people who did their jobs." "Then they should have done different jobs," she said. Something in his posture shifted. Not capitulation, he was reassessing, recalculating, and the recalculation was visible in the way his weight redistributed across his feet. The aircraft moved in a way that was not a correction. It lurched. The nose dropped 2 degrees and the tail swung right, then corrected, but the correction was ragged, not the smooth input of a pilot with full authority. The vibration from the tail changed a resonance cycling at a frequency she felt in her back teeth. The tail rotor. It had been damaged in the LZ, and it was getting worse. The intruder felt it too. His eyes went to the ceiling, the direction of the tail, and stayed there for 1 second. That was her second. She came around the cot, not over it, but around the forward end, and she covered 3 feet of floor, and she brought her left forearm up into his chin from below, while her right hand drove his gun arm to the side. The hit was not devastating. She had the angle and the surprise, and what the hit did was force his head back and put his weight on his heels for the fraction of a second she needed. She drove him toward the open door. She could not move his full weight through 6 feet of cabin floor in a direct push. But she had the angle and she had momentum, and she had his center of gravity moving in the wrong direction, and when the backs of his thighs hit the lower edge of the door frame, he grabbed for the frame with both hands. Both hands on the door frame, neither hand on her, neither hand on a weapon. She stepped back. She had the M9 on him. He was half out the door, feet inside torso, outside the wind at 110 knots, pressing against his chest in face. He was holding himself in by the grip of both hands on the doorframe and the friction of his boots on the lip. He looked at her. She looked at him. "If I let go," he said, his voice flat and factual, "I can't deploy a chute at this altitude and speed. You understand that?" "Then hold on," she said. "Pull yourself back in. Sit on the floor with your hands where I can see them." He looked at her for a moment. Through the ballistic eyewear, she could not read the specific expression, but she could read the calculation, a man determining whether there was any remaining move available to him, and concluding there was not. He pulled himself back in. He sat on the floor of the cabin, back against the starboard wall, hands on his knees. He was breathing hard. His leg was still bleeding. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has made a calculation and is committing to it. She kept the M9 on him with her right hand, and she reached left with her free hand and came out with a flex cuff from the trauma kit. She crossed the cabin to him, staying out of arm's reach until she was directly beside him, and the angle was wrong for him to grab, and she said right hand. He put his right hand out. She cuffed it. She ran the second cuff through the floor tie-down ring to her left, the ring used to anchor equipment during flight, and secured his left wrist. She stood. She looked at him for a moment, and she said, "If the aircraft goes down, I'll cut you loose." He said nothing. She turned back to her patients. Wynn's oxygen saturation was holding, but his color had changed slightly, and she understood what that meant in the context of his injury. The equilibrium she had established with the decompression and the chest seal was under pressure from the continued instability of the thoracic cavity. She adjusted the oxygen flow upward and kept her fingers on his wrist, counting, watching his face. Tanner in the corner had not moved from his position against the aft bulkhead. He was holding his TACSAT phone in his good hand and the screen was on. She looked at him. He looked back at her, then at the phone. Recording. He had been recording since the intruder came through the door. Maybe before. The young soldier from the 327th, 20 years old with a wrapped hand and 8 hours of sustained contact behind him, had decided on his own authority that what was happening in this aircraft needed to exist in a form that could not be denied or quietly absorbed into institutional memory. She did not tell him to stop. She turned forward and keyed her intercom. "Harwick?" The response took a moment longer than it should have. "Go." "What's your status?" Another pause. "Flying." The word stripped to its minimum content told her what she needed to know. She crossed to the forward bulkhead and looked through the small window into the cockpit. The view was partial, but she could see enough. Harwick was in the left seat. His right hand was on the cyclic. His left hand was at his side. The shoulder of his flight suit had a dark stain that was spreading with the slow, steady inevitability of blood moving through fabric. "You're hit," she said. "Left shoulder, through and through, arms still working, mostly." "How much blood?" "Manageable. I've got Grouse's kit, but I can't reach it and fly at the same time." Grouse was unconscious in the right seat, his head at an angle that indicated the concussive impact from the LZ had been significant. Breathing, not flying. Harwick was flying the aircraft with one fully functional arm, a compromised left arm, a gunshot wound she had not treated yet, and a tail rotor that was progressively failing. "What's the tail doing?" she asked. "Losing authority on the left pedal. I can compensate with airspeed, but if it degrades further, I need a surface." A pause. "There's a ridge shelf at about 4 clicks northeast. My nav shows it as potentially usable. Maybe 60 feet of clear ground. It's going to be rough. Can you do it one-handed?" "I've done worse." She believed him. She went back into the cabin and found Grouse's medical kit stowed below his seat, accessible through the gap in the bulkhead panel. She extracted the tourniquet and the pressure bandage and the hemostatic gauze. She pressed them through the panel as far as they would reach and talked Harwick through applying the pressure bandage to himself, one-handed, specific sequential instructions delivered without urgency, because urgency was not what the instructions needed. "Got it," he said after a period during which she could hear the sounds of someone applying pressure to a wound while maintaining control of a helicopter. "Good," she said. "Tell me about the shelf." He told her. The ridge shelf was a natural formation on the northeast face of the valley wall, a ledge of rock and compacted earth that satellite imagery had cataloged as a possible emergency landing site. Narrow, tilted, never used for an actual helicopter landing. Surface composition unknown. She listened and formed a picture. She thought about what it would mean to land on an angled, unknown surface with a progressively failing tail rotor and a pilot operating with one arm and declining blood pressure. "When you set it down," she said, "set the upslope skid first. Right skid if the tilt is what you're describing. You want the rotor disc away from the hillside." "I know," he said. "I know you know. I'm saying it anyway." "Fair enough." She went back to the cabin. Wynn was watching her from the cot with the same flat, deliberate expression he had worn since the extraction, a man who was in significant pain and managing it through will. "You all right?" she asked him. "Functional," he said. His voice was rougher than before. The exertion of the past minutes had cost him something. She checked his IV line and adjusted the flow. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, the flat managed mask giving way slightly like a curtain moved by air from a direction unexpected. "Your father's name was Warren Calloway," he said. She went still. Not externally, her hands continued doing what hands were supposed to do. She went still in the internal way that experienced medical people learn, to go still when a patient says something that requires complete attention. It is not peace. It is the suspension of everything that is not directly relevant. You need to conserve. "I'm going to talk," he said. The will behind his voice was unchanged even as his body was losing ground. Because if we go down on that ridge and it goes wrong, you need to know what I know before that happens. She did not argue. She checked his saturation. She monitored his pulse. She listened. I was attached to the same asset network as your father in 2006, he said. Not same unit, same operational area, same intelligence picture. I was ISA Intelligence Support Activity. We overlapped on an operation in April of that year. He paused to manage his breathing. He was carrying something out of the province, documents from a network that had been compromised. He wasn't supposed to fly that night. The mission was pushed up 12 hours. That's when someone changed the grid coordinates. She said, who changed them? Someone inside the command structure of this FOB, not a field decision made from a desk by a person with authenticated access and a reason that had nothing to do with the mission and everything to do with what your father was carrying. He was bringing documentation that implicated people who had built careers on events the documentation contradicted. Your father's flight that night was the thread that had pulled, unraveled things that certain people had spent years weaving closed. She was counting his pulse. 92 elevated but holding. The USB in my chest pocket, he said. 6 years of material. Everything I could gather, signals, intelligence, imagery, testimony, communications, records. It is the case your father's mission was supposed to generate, finished by someone else 6 years later. He met her eyes directly. I've been trying to get it out of this province for 2 years. Every time I've gotten close, the same people who changed those coordinates in 2006 have found ways to interrupt the process. The aircraft lurched again, more pronounced. The cycling in the tail had become audible in the cabin, now not the sound of a system working, but the sound of a system working far harder than it was designed to work, to produce far less than the result it was designed to produce. Harwick's voice. Calloway, 3 minutes. I need everyone strapped. She looked at Wynne. She began making adjustments to his restraints on the cot framework. She spoke as she worked. The person who changed the coordinates, she said. The person who sent the man through that door. Are they the same person? Yes, he said. He gave her the name. She stopped working for a fraction of a second, so brief that no one watching would have caught it. Then her hands continued. She had heard the name before, in a briefing room, over a radio. She had shaken hands with the person attached to the name, and she had noted something she could not identify, something in the quality of his attention that had registered as a dissonance she could not explain. She could explain it now. He knows you're on this aircraft, she said. He's known since the mission was tasked. The extraction request came through channels he monitors. When he saw my name on the Priority 1 casualty report, he knew what I was carrying. He paused. The man on the floor came from a platform above us. He was set down via fast rope while we were occupied at the LZ. He's been on the exterior since we left. She processed this. Every piece of it went into its correct place, and the picture it assembled was clear and ugly, and she did not look away from it. The USB stays with me, she said. That was always the idea, Wynne said. Then he closed his eyes. His chest was still moving, his pulse still running under her fingers. But the will that had held him present had spent itself on what it needed to spend itself on, and his body was taking what it was owed. She finished securing his restraints. She moved to Eckert and checked his airway. She moved to Holden. She came back to the forward position and strapped herself into the medic's seat. The intruder on the floor had braced himself against the wall with his cuffed hands above the tie-down ring legs, extended good leg angled for maximum floor contact. He had done this without being told. He had been in emergency landings before. Tanner had his back against the aft bulkhead, the Taxat phone secured in his jacket pocket. His good hand gripped the handhold above his position. His jaw was set. He was 20 years old from somewhere in the south, and he had been awake for more than 24 hours. And in the last 20 minutes, he had witnessed things that would not leave him for the rest of his life. And he was holding himself together because there was nothing else to do. She looked at him. He looked back. She gave him one nod. Slow, deliberate. The nod that means you are doing what you are supposed to be doing. He straightened his spine another half-inch. Harwick's voice. Coming up on the shelf, 30 seconds. I'm going to talk through the approach. Don't adjust anything in the back. Understood, she said. Upslope skid first, he said. I know you know, she said. A pause that had the quality of something personal in it. Then, Doc, my boys' names are Jake and Danny, 8 and 5. They're with their grandmother in Billings. She held the intercom button. They're going to hear this story from you, she said. About you, from you. A long pause. Yeah, he said. The aircraft began to descend. She had been in enough unusual flight conditions to have a physical library of what abnormal felt like from the inside of a helicopter. What she was feeling now was something adjacent to all of those, but not identical to any of them. The progressive reduction of control authority, the way Harwick was using airspeed to compensate for what the tail rotor was no longer reliably providing, the increasing delicacy of inputs that under normal conditions would have been routine. He was flying with one arm and a shoulder wound and declining blood pressure, and he was flying it well because the alternative was unacceptable, and he had decided that the alternative was therefore not going to happen. She could feel the ridgeline before she saw it, the way the airflow changed as they descended between the valley walls, the specific turbulence of mountain terrain at low altitude, the way the aircraft slowed as Harwick bled airspeed against the approach gradient. 10 seconds, he said. His voice was unchanged. She closed her eyes for 1 second. She did not pray exactly. She let go of everything that was not directly relevant to the next 60 seconds. The fear, the calculation, the weight of what Wynn had told her, and she held only the immediate and the necessary. Then she opened her eyes. The skid hit the rock. Right skid first upslope, as she had said, as he had known. It hit and held, and for a moment the aircraft was balanced on that single point of contact with the right skid on solid rock, and the rest of the aircraft tilted in the air. The left skid, searching, and then the nose rotated slightly, and the left skid came down and the whole aircraft settled onto the ledge with a grinding, shuddering impact that was not a crash. It was hard. It was rough. It was nothing like a standard landing. But it was a landing, the rotor wound down, the engines came to idle and then to shut down in sequence. The noise that had been constant for 42 minutes dropped away in layers, and the last layer was the sound of the wind on the outside of the aircraft, cold and continuous and very different from silence. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Tessa unstrapped herself and got to work. She was out of her seat before the rotors had fully stopped moving toward her patients with the same purposeful attention she brought to every triage. No panic in the movement, no performance of urgency, simply the correct application of focus in the correct order. Wind saturation had dropped 2 points during the landing, but was stable. Holden was still unconscious, his respiratory pattern unchanged. Eckert was awake, breathing through the pain with the focused concentration of someone who has decided that breathing is the most important thing he is going to do for the next several minutes. Tanner was already unstrapping, standing reaching for the intercom. "Can someone reach the pilot?" he said. To her. She was already moving forward. She got through the cockpit access panel, a narrow gap in the forward bulkhead, functional but not comfortable, and came into the right seat and looked at Harwick. He was still in the left seat with both hands on the cyclic by reflex, his head forward and slightly down. When she reached across and put 2 fingers on his carotid, she found the pulse faster than she wanted, thinner than she wanted, but present and regular. She checked his pupils, equal and reactive. "Harwick." He raised his head. His eyes were clear. "We're down, oh," she said. "Yeah." He looked at her. His face had the particular quality of someone who has been concentrating at maximum capacity for an extended period and is now discovering what is on the other side of that. "Everyone in the back, okay, ma'am, functioning," she said. She was already examining his shoulder. The wound was a through and through, as he had said, entry and exit on the posterior aspect of the left shoulder, no major vessel involvement, but significant muscle damage and blood loss that made his arm unreliable for the foreseeable future. She applied the pressure bandage properly, which was different from the one-handed job he had done on himself, and she gave him a direct look when she was done. "You flew that aircraft for 24 minutes after taking that wound," she said. "Grouse was down," he said. "What else was I going to do?" It was not a question. She understood that. It was the only response that made sense to a man who had decided a long time ago that he was going to be the kind of person who did what needed doing. She did not pursue it. She secured the bandage, and she went back into the cabin. The situation on the ledge was this: one unconscious pilot, one concussed co-pilot, one crew chief with a non-functional arm, one intruder secured to the floor, 4 patients and herself. The aircraft was down on a narrow rock shelf approximately 4 clicks from F.O. Bright on a hillside above the Peach River Valley. She had already transmitted their position on the UHF guard frequency before the landing, quickly and calmly during the approach, because she had thought through the contingency before the contingency arrived. She had not transmitted on the primary frequency. She had reasons for that, and they were good reasons, and they had to do with the name Wynn had given her and the clear connection between that name and what had been done to this mission. She went to the open door and looked out at the ledge. The mountain was immense and close and completely indifferent. The valley was far below the river, a dull silver thread in the late morning light. The air was cold enough to sting the inside of her nose, and the sky above was a deep, specific blue that she knew she would remember for the rest of her life. 9 minutes. She needed to hold this position for 9 minutes. She knew this because the Apache's loiter time was calculable, and the distance from FOB right was known, and the dispatch time for a medevac from right was a variable she could estimate within a reasonable range. 9 minutes was the lower bound. She was good at lower bounds. She went back inside and she went to work. The next 9 minutes were not dramatic. They were the persistent application of correct action in conditions that did not reward correctness with any immediate comfort. She monitored wind saturation and adjusted his oxygen. She managed Eckert's pain at the level that allowed him to breathe adequately without the analgesia compromising his respiratory drive. She kept Harwick talking brief exchanges enough to track his mental status enough to make sure the blood pressure drop was not accelerating. She watched the intruder on the floor, who sat with his cuffed hands and his bleeding leg, and said nothing. Tanner sat against the aft bulkhead with the TAC-SAT phone secured in his jacket pocket and his wrapped hand against his chest, and he watched all of it. He watched the way she moved between patients. He watched the way her hands were always doing something purposeful, the way her face remained level through all of it, not cold, not distant, but held together around something he could not identify but understood in the way that young soldiers sometimes understand things before they have words for them, was the essential thing. The thing that made the difference. At 7 minutes and 50 seconds after landing, she heard it. Rotors, external multiple, getting louder. She went to the door and looked up. 2 Blackhawks approaching from the southwest. Red crosses visible against the gray fuselage even at distance. Dust-off aircraft from FO Bright, not from Blessing from Right, which was the correct origin point and the correct response to the frequency she had used. Behind them, slightly higher and to the right, the Apache from Hawk 2-1, the same aircraft that had been covering their approach into the LZ 42 minutes in a different world ago. Still on station, still watching. She stood in the door of the damaged aircraft on the narrow rock shelf, and she watched them come in, and she felt something that was not quite relief and not quite anything else, but the release of a calculation that had been running continuously for the past 42 minutes and had now arrived at its conclusion. She had kept them alive. All of them. Wynne and Harwick and Grouse and Eckert and Holden and Tanner. She had kept them alive through the extraction and the ambush in the air and the intruder in the cabin and the emergency landing on a rock shelf 4 clicks from anything, and they were alive, and the aircraft was down intact, and the USB drive in Wynne's pocket was still in Wynne's pocket. She had 11 rounds left between 2 magazines. She noted this, filed it. Information. The first of the FOB Right medevacs began its approach to the ledge. The pilot was good, taking his time reading the geometry of the shelf, coming in with a particular care of someone who understood that this was not a standard approach, and that the margin for error was genuinely small. She moved to the side of the ledge and used her arms to signal the approach, the standard ground guide procedure, both arms extended and then drawing together to indicate position and clearance. He set it down cleanly. The medics came out fast, and she met them at the aircraft door and gave them the full brief in under 90 seconds. Wind status, the chest seal, the IV lines, the saturation, the specific concern about adequate re-expansion of the left lung, the morphine dosage on Holden, the airway adjunct on Eckert, the position in which Eckert needed to be moved to protect his burn injuries from secondary trauma during transfer. She gave them all of it clearly and quickly and without hesitation. The lead medic from FOB Right was a staff sergeant in his mid-30s, Pemberton. His name tape read it with the competent, slightly weathered look of someone who had been doing this job for a long time. He listened to her brief with the attention of a professional who recognized professional language being spoken to him. When she finished, he looked at her for a moment. "You've been managing all of this since you left the LZ," he said. "Since before that," she said. "Grouse and Harwick are priority 2 and 3. Harwick first, he flew with that wound for 24 minutes, and he's been losing blood. Grouse has a concussive injury, possible intracranial involvement. Neither should be moved without imaging, clarity on Grouse." "Understood?" Pemberton said. He looked at the intruder on the cabin floor, at the flex cuff on the tie-down ring, at the MP7 still half hanging from the door sill. He looked back at her. His expression did not change, but something in it shifted in the way that a person's expression shifts when their understanding of a situation expands to contain something it did not contain before. "Ma'am," he said. He addressed her as ma'am even though she was a specialist and he outranked her. It was a choice and it was deliberate. Get them loaded, she said. We can discuss it later. She turned back to her patients because the work was not finished, simply because help had arrived. The second medevac set down on the ledge 12 minutes after the first. By then, the first aircraft was already lifting, carrying Wynn and Harwick and Grouse in a configuration that Tessa had supervised directly when on the primary cot oxygen running, IV lines secured against the motion of transfer. The chest seal checked one final time before the door closed. Harwick had been moved to a cot against his preference. He wanted to sit upright, which was what men who have been flying want to do when they stop. They want to maintain the orientation of control. She told him without argument that upright was not an option until someone with imaging equipment had looked inside his shoulder and he lay down because she was right and he knew she was right. Grouse she moved last with the greatest care. A head injury was different from a chest wound. The visible surface told you almost nothing about what was happening underneath it. You moved conservatively, protected the cervical spine, and handed him off to neurology as quickly as the situation allowed. Pemberton had managed Grouse's movement well. She had watched from the door and had not needed to intervene. He knew what he was doing. That was the relief of one competent person discovering that the person working beside them is also competent, not the relief of rescue, but the relief of alignment. The second aircraft took Holden and Eckert. Holden was still unconscious, which remained concerning, but within expected parameters. Eckert was awake and increasingly coherent, the adrenaline and analgesia settling into a kind of managed pain his body was learning to navigate. When they moved him to the second aircraft, he looked at her from the cot. "Thank you, Doc," he said, carefully, deliberately, a person spending words that cost something. "You did the work," she said. "I managed the variables." He almost smiled. Then he was in the aircraft and the door was closed. The intruder was loaded last in flex cuffs with Pemberton sitting across from him in the utility aircraft that arrived third. A warrant officer had also arrived to assess the damaged UH-60 for recovery. A captain from FOB Wright's staff section stepped off the same aircraft, young for a captain, early 30s, with the careful expression of someone who understood he was stepping into a situation he did not fully understand. "Specialist Calloway," he said. "Sir," she said, "walk me through what happened." She walked him through it. Thorough, sequential, precise language, no editorializing. The LZ, the contact, the damage to the aircraft, the intruder, his appearance, equipment, his stated purpose. The specific moment his attention went to the radio equipment. The nav database discrepancy she and Harwick had discovered before the LZ. Landing on the ledge. Wynn's disclosure. The captain listened. He wrote in a small notebook. He asked two clarifying questions, both of which were good. When she finished, he looked at his notes. Then he said, "The name Sergeant First Class Wynn gave you, the individual he's attributing responsibility to." "Yes, sir." "You're certain of what he said?" He said it twice. He was in pain and losing blood, but he was cogent. He knew what he was saying, and he knew why. The captain pressed the tip of his pencil against the page. "I need you to write this up formally as soon as we're back at FOB Wright. Everything you've told me, signed and dated with a request that it be transmitted to Division G2 concurrently with the Apache footage and whatever specialist Tanner has on his TACSAT. That was already my intention, sir." He looked at her with the expression of a young captain encountering someone operating several steps ahead of him. "Right," he said. "Let's get you back." She was the last person to leave the ledge. She stood at the edge for a moment, and she looked out at the valley, at the river below, at the ridgelines holding their shadows at the sky. 62 minutes. One extraction, one ambush in the air, one emergency landing on a rock shelf with no name. 6 people delivered alive. Her father had flown this valley. She was leaving it. She turned and boarded the aircraft, and the ledge was left behind, and the mountains held their silence, as they always had, as they would long after everyone involved in this particular morning was gone. FO Bright was 34 kilometers southeast of Blessing, situated in the Kunar River Valley, where the terrain was marginally less compressed and the valley walls slightly farther apart. It was larger than Blessing, better resourced with a proper surgical facility that had an operating room and an anesthesiologist and the kind of equipment that a tension pneumothorax patient needed after a chest seal and a needle decompression. The flight from the ridge to FOB Wright took 11 minutes. During those 11 minutes, Tessa sat in the utility aircraft and she let her mind go quiet for the first time since the morning briefing. Not fully quiet, there is no fully quiet for a person who has spent 42 minutes in the conditions she had been in. There is a kind of managed quiet, the deliberate suspension of processing the decision to stop analyzing for a defined period and let the immediate mechanics of breathing and existing do their work without narration. Her father had taught her this too. After a hard day on the range, after a long training session, he would sit on the porch with her and they would not speak, and he would say afterward that the silence was part of the work, that the mind needed what the land needed after a hard season, a fallow period brief and deliberate before the next planting. She had 11 minutes. She used them. The aircraft came in over the southern wall of FOB Wright, and the pilot brought it down with the easy authority of someone who had made this approach many times. The landing pad at Wright was larger than the one at Blessing, better marked with a permanent perimeter of sandbag barriers and a wind indicator showing a steady cross component from the northeast. She did not see the crowd immediately. She was looking at the surgical facility entrance, where she expected to see the medical team managing the transfer of Wynn and the others. The first medevac had landed approximately 25 minutes ahead of them, enough time for initial triage and to get Wynn into the operating room if the surgical team had been ready. They had been ready. The movement at the surgical entrance was the controlled urgency of a team that had received its pre-notification and prepared accordingly. Then she looked at the landing pad itself. It had filled. Not gradually as it might if someone had called an assembly. In the specific unplanned way that forward operating bases fill towards significant events, people arriving from different directions and different tasks, drawn by the transmission of information through the informal channels that exist in every military installation and carry certain categories of news faster than any official system. Word had traveled from the Apache pilot to the FOB Wright radio operator to the first person the radio operator had spoken to after logging the transmission, and from there it had spread the way. Such things spread in confined communities where everyone's life is entangled with everyone else's. Soldiers from the 327th Infantry who had been at FOB Wright since the previous day, men who had not been in the contact that their Bravo Company element had made, who had been here managing logistics and communications, and the 100 small tasks that sustained forward operations, who knew that 4 of their people had gone out on that medevac and had been waiting for word of what happened. Those men were at the front of the crowd, some of them still carrying the tools of whatever they had been doing when the word reached them. Pilots from the aviation unit stood slightly apart from the infantry, not because of distance between communities, but because they had gathered from the same direction and stood in the natural cluster of people who had come from the same place. They understood what had happened to this crew in the way that aviators understand these things directly, without abstraction, with a specific knowledge of what a compromised aircraft felt like from the inside. Medical staff from the surgical facility who were not needed in the ORR, supply clerks, communications operators, mechanics from the motor pool, the man who ran the chow hall, 2 interpreters from the intelligence section. They were there because the human impulse toward witness is not limited by job description. Nobody had been told to be there. Nobody had been ordered into formation. They were just there. The utility aircraft settled onto the pad, and the rotors began their wind down, and the door slid open. Tanner came out first. He stepped down from the aircraft with his wrapped hand held against his chest, and he looked out at the crowd, and his face did something that was visible from 50 feet away, a loosening, a release, the carefully maintained structure of a 20-year-old soldier who has been holding himself together through more than he has had to hold himself together through before finally arriving at a moment where holding together is no longer the only available option. His eyes filled. He did not cover his face. He stood at the door of the aircraft and he looked at the men looking at him, and he let what was in him be visible because he was too tired and too wrung out and too young to do anything else, and because what was in him was not weakness, but something that did not have a better word than relief. The first soldier from the 327th, who recognized him, a corporal from the same platoon, a man who had been at FOB Wright when the contact happened, and had spent the last 8 hours managing the particular anguish of being safe while others were not crossed the perimeter at a run, and caught Tanner by the shoulder. Tanner said something. 4 sentences by the count of the people standing close enough to hear. Nobody who was asked later could reconstruct them exactly, but the substance was clear enough, and it spread outward from the corporal to the men around him, to the men behind them, moving in ripples across the crowd, the way a stone moves water, and as it moved, things changed in the faces of the men it reached. Pemberton from the FOB Wright medevac unit came out next. He paused at the door of the aircraft because even a professional arriving after the fact could feel the quality of the attention on this landing pad, the way you feel certain kinds of weather before you see them. He stepped down and moved aside. And then Tessa came out. She stepped down from the aircraft the way she stepped down from every aircraft, one hand on the frame, one foot finding the ground, the other foot following the transition made without ceremony, because she did not make ceremonies of things that did not require them. Her boots hit the pad, and she straightened, and she looked out. The first thing she felt was the wind. It was coming from the northeast at approximately 12 knots, and it hit her face directly, and it was cold, and it smelled of rock and altitude and the particular dryness of October in Kunar province. She had not been outside without something to do for the past 62 minutes, and the wind on her face had the quality of something arriving rather than something passing. The second thing she felt was the attention. She had been the focus of attention before on ranges in trainings, scenarios, and evaluations where she was the subject being assessed. She understood what it felt like to have people watching her. This was not that. This was something with a different quality, a different texture. It was not the attention of assessment. It was the attention of recognition. The difference between being seen as a subject and being seen as a person, and everything that distinction contained. She stood at the edge of the aircraft and she looked at the crowd and the crowd looked at her. The first man to cry was a sergeant from the infantry. He was large, broad across the chest, the kind of build that comes from genuine physical labor, sustained over years, and he had the face of someone who had been in difficult places long enough to have decided that his face was not a place where private things happened. He had that discipline. It was visible, and it gave way, not loudly, not dramatically. His jaw tightened in the specific way that jaws tighten when something is pushing from behind the face and the face is not strong enough to hold it, and then his eyes filled and he did not look away. He stood at the edge of the landing pad and he wept without moving. The man beside him saw it happen, and then the man beside him. It moved through the crowd the way it had moved before, not as a synchronized response, but as a series of individual surrenders, each one independent, each one private, each one witnessed by the person next to them. Men who had held themselves intact through things that would have undone most people stood on a landing pad in Kunar province on a cold October morning and cried, and they did not look away from what they were crying at. They were not crying because she was a woman. They were not crying because she was young or small or because any of the visible things about her were remarkable. They were crying because Tanner had told the corporal what had happened in that aircraft, and those 4 sentences had moved through the crowd and reached every man standing there. And those men had understood, in the direct physical way, that soldiers understand things that matter exactly what it meant. One person, against harm, for people who could not protect themselves, in a broken aircraft above a hostile valley with no help available and no guarantee of outcome. And she had won. Not because she had superior training or superior equipment or superior numbers. She had won because she had been prepared and because she had not stopped, and because the preparation and the refusal to stop are the same thing expressed at different stages of the same continuous act. Men who had spent years learning to do that same thing stood on that pad and recognized it, and the recognition was the kind that does not stay behind the face. Tessa stood at the edge of the aircraft and let them look. She did not walk toward them. She did not make a gesture. She did not perform anything for the moment because the moment did not require performance. It required presence, and she was present. Then she walked toward the surgical facility entrance. She walked the way she walked onto every landing zone purposefully with the tasks she needed to complete organized in their correct sequence. She needed to check on Win. She needed to verify Harek's status. She needed to write her formal report and get it into the right channels. She needed to ensure that the TACSAT footage and the Apache recordings were transmitted to Division G2 without routing through FO blessing. These were the things that needed to happen next. The men at the edge of the perimeter stepped back to let her pass, and as she moved through them, she was aware of the specific quality of the space they made, not the space people make for a person they want to avoid, but the space people make for a person they are not certain how to be close to in a moment this large. She moved through it without ceremony and without haste. She went inside. The surgical facility at FOB Wright was a building constructed to function rather than impress. The walls were plywood, the lighting fluorescent, the equipment reliable under conditions that consumer-grade equipment would not survive. The OR was in the back, and the pre-op and post-op areas were separated from it by a curtained corridor. Wynn was in the OR. The duty nurse who met Tess at the entrance told her the team had been working on him for 25 minutes, and that surgical access to the chest cavity had revealed the damage she had expected, and that the team was managing it with the resources they had, and that his blood pressure had stabilized since they had established proper fluid resuscitation. He was going to make it. The certainty of that settled in her without drama. She noted it, she allowed it to be real, and she moved on. Harwick was in the post-op area on a cot, his shoulder dressed properly, his blood pressure being monitored. He was awake. His color was better than it had been on the ridge. She sat on the edge of the cot beside him. He looked at her with the expression of someone who has been concentrating at maximum capacity and is now in the aftermath of that, the slightly unmoored quality of a person whose emergency is over and who is discovering what that means. Grouse, he asked. Imaging shows no intracranial bleed, she said. Concussion. He'll be down a few weeks, but he's okay. Harwick nodded. He looked at the ceiling. She said, you flew that aircraft for 24 minutes with a gunshot wound and one functional arm. Grouse was down, he said. There was nobody else. She waited. He said quietly, I kept thinking about Jake and Danny, that they needed me to get that aircraft down. They do, she said, and you did. He looked at her. His eyes had the particular focus that pain and blood loss produce in people who will not let themselves be less than fully present. What happened in the back, he said. All of it. She told him. She kept it brief and complete in equal measure. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. The nurse checked his blood pressure and noted it and moved away. He said, your father. Yes. What are you going to do with that? The next thing first, she said. Report. Footage transmitted through the right channels. Make sure Wynn is positioned to give his testimony when he's recovered. Make sure the documentation reaches people who cannot be reached by whoever sent the man through that door. And then, she looked at him. I'll figure out then when then arrives. He almost smiled. Close enough. Callaway, he said, I've flown with a lot of medics. She waited. You held that aircraft together, he said. Not just the patients. The whole thing. I could feel it from the cockpit. He looked at her. I don't know how to say that better than that. You don't need to say it better, she said. Rest. Your boys need you functional. She left him to the recovery his body was insisting on. She found the captain from the ledge in the small administrative space adjacent to the communications room. She sat at the desk and she wrote her formal report. She wrote it the way she did everything, completely in the correct sequence, with precise language and no editorializing. She described every action she had taken from the moment of the briefing to the moment the last aircraft left the ridge shelf. She included the nav database discrepancy she and Harwick had discovered mid-flight. She included the intruder's equipment profile and his stated purpose, and the specific moment that had indicated external communication. She included Wynn's disclosure. She included the name. She wrote it clearly and completely, not as an accusation framed in institutional language, as a factual account with specific attributions dated and signed. When she finished, she gave it to the captain. He read it carefully, and when he finished reading, he looked at the last paragraph for a long moment, and then he looked at her. This is going to move quickly once it leaves this building, he said. Yes, sir. Are you prepared for that? She considered the question honestly. I've been prepared for it for 5 years, she said. I just didn't have the evidence until today. He reached for his radio. The Apache footage was transmitted to Division G2 at Bagram at 14:22 hours via the aviation unit's secure channel, with the notation in the header that it was not to be routed through FOB Blessing Command. The notation was unusual. The Apache pilot who transmitted it was prepared for questions about it and answered them with the directness of someone who had looked at his own footage and understood exactly what it contained. Tanner's TACSAT recording was transmitted 15 minutes later through the same channel. Tessa's formal report arrived at Division G2 at 14:58, transmitted by the captain through the Division JAG's office in parallel with the G2, also unusual, and a decision the captain had made after reading the name in the report and thinking carefully about what that meant. The USB drive was with Wynn in the surgical facility, logged as personal effects belonging to an INSCOM asset requiring specific clearance for access. Tessa had specified this arrangement when she transferred the drive to the Provost Marshal's custody before she wrote her report because sequencing mattered. At 16:40 hours, a CID agent arrived at FOB Wright by helicopter from Bagram. He was a chief warrant officer, mid-40s, with the patient and unremarkable manner of someone whose work requires patience and the deliberate management of outward appearance. He reviewed the documentation. He asked Tessa 2 specific questions, both of which she answered directly. Then he used the FOB Wright Secure Communications Facility to make a call she was not party to and did not need to be party to. She sat in the waiting area outside the communications room and waited. That evening, at a time and through a process she was not present for and did not witness, an officer at FOB Blessing was placed under a formal investigative restriction that limited his communications and his movement, And that would be followed in the weeks and months ahead by processes considerably more consequential. The restriction was applied by people with the authority to apply it based on documentation that had moved through the correct channels during the preceding hours, and it was applied completely. It held. Some things hold when you put them in front of the right people with the right documentation. That is not guaranteed. It is not the norm. But it happens, and when it happens, it matters. And the reason it happened in this case was because a 27-year-old flight medic had made certain on a rock ledge in Kunar province with an unconscious crew and 4 patients around her that the documentation got to the right people through the right channels before anyone had the opportunity to redirect it. She had known this was necessary before the aircraft landed. She had made the decision in the air when she identified the communications pattern in the intruder's body language, and she had acted on it without deviation because decisions that require deviation between the making and the execution are decisions that do not survive their execution intact. Her father had taught her this too, not in those words, in the way he taught her most things by showing her what it looked like in practice. She did not find out about the man who had been standing at the edge of the landing pad crowd until the following morning, Tanner told her. He had noticed the man during the crowd scene and had registered something specific about him. The man was not behaving the way everyone else in the crowd was behaving. He was not moving forward with the general momentum. He was not reacting visibly to what was happening. He was standing at the far edge of the perimeter, near the sandbags on the eastern side, and he was watching with the quality of attention that was different from the attention of the soldiers around him. It was the attention of someone who had already known most of what was happening and was watching to confirm the part he had not known. Tanner had noted him, and then the moment had absorbed his attention, and he had forgotten about the man until he was reviewing his TACSAT footage the following morning, and he saw at the edge of the frame the figure standing apart from the crowd. He described the man to her. 50, perhaps 52. Civilian clothes chosen with care. Not the careless civilian dress of a contractor living on a FOB, but clothes selected deliberately with the specific purpose of being unremarkable. He had been standing in a position that gave him a clear view of the aircraft door and of Tessa as she stepped out, and he had been standing there the entire time, and when the crowd began to disperse, he had walked away in a direction that Tanner had not tracked. She listened. She filed the information in the place where she kept things that were not yet resolved, but needed to be held in a state of readiness for when they became relevant again. They became relevant again that evening. She was sitting on the steps outside the post-op building in the hour when the light was going horizontal and the mountains were taking on their evening colors, amber and violet, and the first deep blue of coming night. She was not doing anything in particular. She was sitting the way she sat on the helipad each morning, present, quiet, letting the moment be what it was. The man sat down beside her. He did not ask permission. He did not introduce himself. He sat down with the ease of familiarity that has nothing to do with the specific place and everything to do with the specific activity, the ease of someone who has sat in many uncomfortable places and has long since stopped expecting them to be comfortable. He was the age Tanner had described. Silver gray hair cut short. His clothes were what she would have categorized as deliberately unremarkable. His hands on his knees were still, and his posture was the posture of someone who was neither tense nor relaxed, but simply present, which was its own category, distinct from both. He looked at the mountains. She looked at the mountains. He said, "You did good work today." She said nothing. "Wynn has been trying to get that documentation out of this province for 2 years," he said. "He came close twice before. This is the first time the chain has held." She waited. "The people who sent the man through your door are going to face what's coming to them. Not because of today alone, but today was what made the case complete." She said, "Who are you?" He considered the question in the specific way of someone deciding not which version of the truth to tell, but how much of it to tell in this particular moment. "Someone who has been watching this situation for a long time," he said. "Longer than Wynn, though Wynn didn't know that. I work for an organization that does not benefit from having its name in reports, which is why my name is not in any of yours." He looked at her. "I was at the landing pad this afternoon. I've been on this base since 0600. She said, "Why?" "Because I needed to confirm that what I've been doing for the past 3 years was going to produce the outcome I believed it could produce. Because there are people I work with who are skeptical, and skeptical people require evidence." He paused. "You were the evidence today." She looked at him directly. "My father." He held her eyes. He did not look away from the directness of the question. The answer had weight in it, and he did not pretend it did not. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. He took out a photograph. He held it out to her. She took it. It was a developed print processed through specific equipment rather than printed from a consumer device. The image was taken from distance, a long lens, the edges slightly compressed by telephoto compression. It showed a man standing in front of a low stone building somewhere in mountain terrain. The surrounding topography was not Kunar. The rock formations were different, the vegetation sparse, in a way that suggested higher elevation and a more northerly latitude. Pakistan, possibly. Or the border region, somewhere in the range of the Karakoram. The man in the photograph was standing in profile, partly turned away from the camera. Thinner than the man in the Fort Campbell photograph she carried in her chest pocket. Hair longer. A beard. But the set of his shoulders and the way he stood, the specific quality of stillness in his posture, the weight distributed forward and balanced ready without being tense, was unmistakable. She had known that posture since she was 5 years old. In the lower right corner of the photograph, stamped by the camera's internal clock, were a date and a time. September 14th, 2009. She looked at the photograph for a long time. The light changed around her, the mountains going from amber to violet to the first deep blue of coming night. She held the photograph in both hands, and she looked at it, and she did not speak. "We located him through signals intelligence in the spring of that year," the man said. "He was not where the official record placed him. He was not in the location associated with the operation reported as the cause of his death. He was being precise rather than careful. There was a difference from Rome. He was alive. He was being held by a small group that had been paid to maintain his detention. This was not a Taliban operation. It was a private arrangement funded through channels that the documentation Wynne was carrying will help trace," she said. "Paid by whom?" He held her eyes. The answer was in the look, not evasion, but the acknowledgement that some questions were going to have answers soon enough through the processes that were now in motion and did not need to be answered speculatively now. "What's being done?" she said. "What became possible today," he said, "is that the documentation can now be acted on through proper channels without the people it implicates being in a position to interfere. That changes what's possible in terms of the official process for locating and recovering someone whose detention was enabled by the same individuals the documentation implicates." She parsed this. The thing that had prevented an official recovery operation, the people who had made it in someone's interest to keep her father where he was, were now facing consequences that would remove them from any position from which they could prevent that operation. "How long?" she said. "I don't know. Honestly, there are processes involved that I can predict only so far." He looked at the mountains for a moment. "What I can tell you is that the path was blocked. It is not blocked now. What happens on an open path depends on the people who walk it." She looked at the photograph. Then she reached into her chest pocket and took out the Fort Campbell photograph, her father in April light, squinting alive and uncomplicated. She placed the two photographs side by side on her knee. Two images. Two moments of the same life. Fort Campbell, 2003. An unnamed mountain location, September 2009. 6 years between them, and a silence she was only now beginning to understand. She looked at both photographs for a long moment. Then she placed them together, the old one and the new one, her father, in the two moments of a life that had not ended the way she had been told it ended, and she folded them together and put them in her chest pocket. Both of them, together, where they would stay. She said, "Is there anything you need from me?" He stood. He adjusted his jacket. He looked at the mountains with the look of a man who has spent a great deal of time in difficult places and carries them with him. "Keep doing what you're doing," he said. "The rest is already in motion." He walked away. She did not watch him go. She listened to his footsteps until they were gone, and then she sat in the silence that remained, holding the two photographs in her chest pocket like two halves of the same proof. She sat for a long time. Then she went inside to prepare for tomorrow. 6 months later, the light was different. Not dramatically. The light changed slowly in Fort Campbell, moving through the seasons without announcement, and by April of 2012, the afternoons had a quality of warmth that the October light in Kunar had not possessed. She had been back in the United States for 2 months. She was sleeping better than she had in a long time. The dreams that had occupied the edges of her nights for 3 months in Afghanistan, not nightmares precisely, but the active, unresolved processing that manifests in sleep, when the waking mind has not had sufficient time, had quieted to an occasional residue present sometimes in the first moments of consciousness and gone when she was fully awake. The investigation that had begun on the day the medevac landed had moved through its stages with the particular pace that military justice moves, not fast by civilian standards, but steadily and without the interruptions that had characterized every previous attempt to bring the relevant information into the relevant processes. The individuals named in Wynn's documentation faced proceedings that were ongoing and that she followed from a distance as a named witness through communications with JAG officers managing the case. Wynn had been medically evacuated to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany 6 hours after the surgery at FOB Wright, and from there to Walter Reed in Washington, and he had spent 11 weeks in recovery and had emerged from it with the scar he described as a reasonable trade for everything it had cost him to acquire it. He had given his formal testimony to the Senate Armed Services Committee in closed session in February. The proceedings were classified at a level that restricted public disclosure, which she had expected and understood. The machinery of these things moved in the spaces that accountability required, and those spaces were not always visible. Harwick had flown again in April, his first flight after 4 months of recovery and physical therapy and the kind of patience that does not come easily to pilots. He had called her the day before. "Doc," he said, "I need to hear your voice before I get back in the aircraft." "Fly," she said. "You know how to fly." "Yeah," he said, "I do." He flew the next morning. He sent her a brief message afterward. No sentences, just the coordinates of Fort Campbell and the time and an altitude, the altitude he had reached on his first post-recovery flight. She looked at the number and she understood what it meant to him, how high it was, what it represented to be that far above the ground again, on the other side of everything that had happened. Grouse had been cleared for return to flight duty 6 weeks before Harwick, his concussion having resolved cleanly without the complications that had been possible. He had called her when his clearance came through. He was not a man of many words. He said, "Callaway?" She said, "Grouse?" He said, "Good." She said, "Yeah." He said, "Okay then." And he hung up. Conard had been back in the rotation for 4 months. His arm had healed well, the fragment wound closing cleanly without infection or nerve damage. He had been assigned as crew chief on Harwick's aircraft when Harwick returned to duty, which was an arrangement that neither of them had requested officially, but that the assignment process had produced as if by logic. She had heard from Pemberton, the FOB Wright medic, that the two of them were operating as smoothly as if they had been flying together for years. Tanner had been medically evacuated 2 days after the landing, his hand injury requiring a level of surgical repair that FOB Wright couldn't provide. He had spent 3 weeks at Landstuhl and then 4 months stateside for rehabilitation and evaluation. He was back in theater now with the same unit with a hand that worked at approximately 92% of its previous capacity, which he described in the interview that a journalist from a major newspaper had requested and that the Army had approved with specific parameters as pretty good for a hand that almost wasn't there. The journalist's article had been the careful kind, the kind that respected the classified elements while conveying enough of the story that the people who needed to know would know. Tanner's name was in it. Wynn's was not by agreement. Tessa's was not by her own request. The article described what had happened on that aircraft in October 2011 in general terms that were accurate without being specific. And it had been read by enough people in enough places that certain things became harder to deny that had previously been easy to deny. That was enough. That was what it needed to do. She was standing in front of 16 people on a Tuesday morning in April when the notification arrived on her phone, a message from the number she had been told to watch, the number attached to the man who had sat beside her on the steps outside the post-op building and given her a photograph in the fading light. The message was short. It contained a set of coordinates and a date 2 weeks from now and 4 words. "We are moving forward." She read it twice. She put the phone in her pocket. She looked at the 16 people in front of her. They were a range of ages and backgrounds and experience levels. The youngest was 22 from Oregon, with the specific directness that people from the Pacific Northwest sometimes have. The oldest was 31, a former EMT, who had come to the Army later than most. They were all smart. They were all serious. They had the quality of people who had chosen this specific work, the combination of medicine and proximity to violence, the particular terrain of saving lives in places designed to end them, because something in them was drawn to it in a way they did not always have full language for, but that was real and would serve them when everything else was insufficient. The course was called Integrated Combat Medicine. It was 14 days residential for flight medics who had completed their initial qualification and were preparing for their first deployment to a combat theater. The curriculum covered standard TCCC at advanced level flight-specific medical management in a section that had not existed in any prior flight medic curriculum and that she had written herself. The section was called Decision-Making Under Degraded Conditions. It was not about tactics. It was about the specific mental and physical processes that determine what a person actually does when everything that could go wrong has gone wrong and there is nobody else available to make the decision. It was about the difference between training and performance, between knowing what to do and doing it in conditions that training does not fully simulate. It was about the gap, the real gap, the one that nobody talked about enough between the person who goes to the field and the person who comes back. She had written it from experience, all of it from experience. On the first day of the course, she had asked the class a question. She had asked them to consider a scenario. You are the flight medic on a medevac aircraft that has taken damage and is inbound to a forward operating base with injured crew and critical casualties. You are alone in the medical cabin. The crew chief is incapacitated. The co-pilot is unconscious. The aircraft commander is flying with a wound you cannot treat until the aircraft is on the ground. In this scenario, what is your job? The answers had been thoughtful. Some of the students had focused on patient management. Some had focused on communication with the aircraft commander. One had talked about force protection considerations. One had talked about documentation. She had listened to all of them. Then she had said your job is everything, not in sequence, not in priority order. Everything simultaneously in the order that the situation actually presents it to you, which will not be the order that any manual or any scenario has prepared you for. Your job is to be the thing that holds when everything else has stopped holding. Can you tell us more about that? The 22-year-old from Oregon had asked. She had told them. Not everything, some of it was still classified, and some of it she held close because it was hers, and it was not yet ready to be anyone else's. But enough to make the gap visible. Enough to let them understand that the gap existed and that crossing it was possible, and that the crossing looked like something specific. It looked like a woman keeping 6 people alive in a broken aircraft over a mountain valley with no guarantee of outcome, because the people could not keep themselves alive, and she was the one who was there. Today was the 4th day of a new cohort. The Oregon student was 3 months ahead now in a different assignment, and the 16 people in front of her were new to this room and to her and to the specific education she was trying to give them. One of them, a young man from Indiana, 24 years old, with the earnest and slightly formal quality of someone who had been told his whole life to work hard and take things seriously and had done both, asked the question she had been waiting for since the first class began. Specialist Calloway, he said, what do you do when you're the only one left? The room went quiet, the specific quiet of people who understand that the question just asked is the real question, the one underneath all the other questions, the one that every person in the room had been carrying since before they walked through the door. She looked at the young man from Indiana. She thought about the ledge. She thought about the open door and the cold wind and a man twice her size trying to take something that she was not going to let him take. She thought about Harwick's voice through the intercom stripped of everything except its minimum content flying. She thought about Wynn's eyes clear and deliberate even as his body was losing ground, spending the last of his energy on information that needed to reach her, because if it did not reach her, it would be lost. She thought about 2 photographs in her chest pocket, one from 2003 and one from 2009 folded together. She thought about 4 words on a phone screen. We are moving forward. She thought about her father in the woods behind the house in Tennessee, standing behind her, asking her to look at the ridge and tell him where the danger was. She thought about the way he stood, the specific quality of stillness, ready without being tense. She thought about all of it for one moment, and then she set it aside because these people in front of her needed her to be present for them, and being present for them was what she was here to do. You do exactly what you were trained to do, she said, in exactly the order you were trained to do it. You do not skip steps because you are afraid. You do not add steps because you are afraid. You are afraid that is not a problem to be solved, it is a condition to be managed. You hold the fear the way you hold any variable. You note it, you account for it, and you work. The room was still. The patients you are going to treat, she said, are going to be in the worst moments of their lives. They are going to be afraid and in pain, and most of them are going to have no control over what happens to them. The one thing they will have, the one resource they will have is you, your hands, your training, and the fact that you stayed when staying was the harder option. She paused. That is not a small thing, she said. That is everything. She looked at the 16 people in front of her. Each of them in some months or some years would be in an aircraft over difficult terrain with people who needed them to be exactly what they had trained to be. Each of them would have a moment when the situation was larger than the training, when the gap appeared when the decision had to be made without the guarantee of outcome. She could not close that gap for them, and she could give them the best possible preparation for standing in it. That was the work. It had always been the work. She turned to the whiteboard. She picked up the marker. She had written these words at the beginning of every session of every cohort she had taught, and she would write them again, and the students would copy them into their notes and would not fully understand the weight of them until they had been in the field long enough to need them. But they would have the words. And when the moment came, the words would be there. She wrote the first line, "Heal when you can." She wrote the second line, "Fight when you must." She set the marker down. She looked at the words for a moment, not reading them. She knew them completely, but doing something else with the looking something that was partly private and partly for the people in front of her, and partly for a man in a photograph standing in front of a stone building in mountain terrain on a September morning 3 years ago. Then she turned back to the class. "Let's start," she said. Outside the windows of the building, the Fort Campbell morning was getting on with itself. Helicopters in the distance, the routine sounds of a base conducting its operations, the specific quality of April light that was warm without being fully spring, transitional, in the way that mornings are transitional. The mountains were not visible from here, but they were there as they always are in the places where the things that matter most have happened, holding their silence in their record of everything that has passed through them. In Kunar Province, 6 months before, on a narrow rock shelf on a hillside above the Peach River Valley, a woman had kept 6 people alive in conditions that had not been designed for survival. She had done it with her hands and her training in the specific thing that her father had given her in 15 years of standing beside her in difficult places and asking her to look carefully at what was in front of her and then asking her what she saw. She had done it with that. And the people who had been in that aircraft who had survived because she was there, because she stayed, because she was exactly the thing that she had spent 15 years becoming, would carry that knowledge for the rest of their lives. Not as a story about her, as a story about what is possible when a person is prepared and refuses to stop. Caleb Tanner would testify before the Senate Armed Services Committee 8 months later in open session in language that was direct and unadorned, and that the members of the committee received in the specific silence of people understanding something they had not understood before. He would describe what he had seen in that aircraft. He would describe it carefully, fully, with the particular authority of a person who has decided that what they witnessed deserves to be witnessed again by as many people as need to witness it. When he finished, a senator from the southern coast of the United States, a man in his late 60s who had served in the Navy 40 years before, and who had, by his own account, not cried in public since 1987, would take off his glasses, press his thumb and forefinger to the bridge of his nose, and sit in the silence for 15 seconds before asking his next question. The transcript would note in the standard notation used for such moments, pause. That pause would say more than anything that followed it. Garrett Wynn would recover fully. His testimony given in closed session would form the evidential core of the proceedings against the individuals named in his documentation and confirmed in Tessa's report. The proceedings would be long. They would be thorough. They would be consequential. Military justice moves slowly, and it is not infallible, and it does not always reach the outcomes that the evidence points toward. But it moves, and it reached, and the outcomes it produced in this case were the outcomes that the evidence pointed toward. The investigation opened the hatch that had been closed over Warren Calloway's file for 5 years. What the investigation found in that file, and what the processes that followed the investigation were able to verify through channels that had not been available until the documentation, when carried, had been properly received, pointed toward a location and toward a set of people and toward a set of actions that had been possible for some time but not pursued. They were pursued. The rest of that story belongs to a different time and a different account, and its details are not fully available, and some of them may not be available for a long time. But the direction was set. The path was open. The people who had closed it were no longer in a position to close it. And a woman who had come to Kunar Province 3 months earlier with a photograph in her chest pocket and a question she needed answered was now standing in front of 16 young medics with 2 photographs in that pocket, instead of one teaching them the thing her father had spent 15 years teaching her. The mountains hold everything that passes through them, but the people who pass through them carry it further. Owen Harwick flew for another 4 years before he retired, accumulating more air medals than he kept track of, and declining every interview request with the same two-word answer, "Thank you." He went back to Montana to the ranch outside Billings, and his boys Jake and Danny grew up in the specific way that children grow up when they know from an early age that their father has done something that mattered. Not loudly, quietly, with the kind of foundation that holds. Seth Kennard flew until his enlistment ended in 2013, and then re-enlisted because when he asked himself what he wanted to do with his life, the answer was straightforward. He became a senior crew chief and eventually an instructor, and the medics who flew with him in the years that followed noted that he watched them with a specific quality of attention, not skepticism, but readiness. The readiness of someone who had been wrong before about what a person was capable of and did not intend to make assumptions again. Leland Grouse retired in 2014 and went back to Wyoming and was by all accounts entirely satisfied with this. He had always been a man of few words, and he saw no reason to change. Wade Eckert's burns healed slowly and not completely, the scarring on his legs and feet permanent in ways that changed how he moved through the world. He was medically separated from the Army in 2012 and went home to a small town in western Pennsylvania and became in time an EMT because it was the closest available thing to the thing he had experienced, being on the receiving end of, and he wanted to be on the other end. Caleb Tanner stayed in the Army. He is still in the Army. He does not talk about October 2011 often, but when he does, he talks about it directly and without drama, with the specific authority of a person who was there and knows exactly what was there with them. Bryce Holden recovered from his shoulder and hip wounds and returned to his unit and completed his deployment and went home. He named his first daughter, born in 2013, Morgan, which was not a family name and which he did not explain to the people who asked, though the explanation would have been simple. It was the middle name of the medic who had kept him alive long enough to have a daughter. The investigation into the coordination of the compromised mission and the events surrounding it resulted in a court-martial that concluded in 2013. The verdict was what the evidence supported. The sentencing was what the verdict required. It was not satisfying in the way that simple resolutions are satisfying, because nothing about it was simple, and the damage it addressed had been done years before and could not be undone. But it was accountability, which is a different thing from satisfaction and which matters more. The classified proceeding that resulted from Wynn's testimony and the documentation he carried produced outcomes in 2013 and 2014 that remain substantially classified. What is known is that the outcome included a formal review of the Warren Calloway file and a finding that the original determination of death was based on incomplete and in some respects deliberately falsified information, and that this finding opened a subsequent process. The subsequent process is ongoing. The photographs in Tessa Calloway's chest pocket, now number 3. The third photograph was given to her in November 2013 by the man with silver gray hair in a meeting that took place in a building in Washington, D.C. That does not appear in any public directory. The third photograph shows the same man as the second in a location she cannot identify at a date 2 years more recent than the second photograph. He is thinner. His hair is longer. He looks older in the specific way that people look older when they have spent years in circumstances that do not allow for the ordinary replenishments of ordinary life. But the way he stands is unchanged. The weight forward and balanced ready, without being tense, the stillness that belongs to a man who has learned to exist in difficult places without being consumed by them. She knows that posture. She has been learning from it since she was 12 years old. She keeps the third photograph with the other two folded together in the chest pocket of every uniform she wears. She is still waiting. She is still working. She has learned that these two things are not in conflict with each other, that the waiting and the working are the same activity expressed at different scales, that a person can hold a grief or a hope or an unanswered question in the middle of everything they do and still do everything they do well, that the holding does not diminish the work and the work does not diminish the holding. Her father taught her this too. She is still learning from him even now, even from a distance she cannot measure to a location she cannot name, across a silence that she no longer believes is permanent. She is at the whiteboard on a Tuesday morning in April, and the mountains are not visible from here, but they are there, and she is writing the words her father gave her and that she is giving now to 16 more people who will someday need them. Heal when you can, fight when you must, never choose. She sets down the marker and she looks at the class. Let's start, she says, and they do.